A single empire in Europe would take over a quarter of the planet's land and population. The foundations began on the lands of England with a powerful British monarchy igniting an extraordinary story of exploration and world domination. The British Empire saw the greatest stories of human achievement and triumph, but also saw the worst sides of humanity. After the discovery of America, around 500 years ago, they ventured out into the oceans. The British would encounter unknown civilizations, creating historic partnerships and rivalries. Within 4 centuries, the empire would be worth over $600 billion. But how did an empire that owned parts of the Americas, Asia, Africa, and even Australia eventually come to an end? We must start from the beginning. Music. Long before the knowledge of far-flung places, a man by the name of King Alfred the Great had to defend his small Anglo-Saxon kingdom from the invading Danish Vikings. In 878 AD, the Vikings, under Guthrum, launched a massive invasion, and Alfred was forced to retreat to the marshlands of Somerset, where he sought refuge on the Isle of Athy. Alfred used this time to regroup and gather loyal followers. He formed a strong army, and in a decisive battle at Edington, he defeated the Viking leader Guthrum. The victory forced Guthrum to sign the Treaty of Wedor, which established the Danelaw law region of England, where Viking rule was officially recognized, but also secured peace between the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons. He then began the process of unifying all of the Anglo-Saxon kingdom, which his grandson Athlin would finish in 924, when Athlin ascended to the throne of Wessex. His rule faced opposition and challenges from rival claimants, particularly from the Viking-controlled areas of Northumbria and Mercia. Despite these obstacles, Athlin proved to be a capable and determined leader. In 927 AD, Athlin managed to conquer Northumbria and effectively unite England under his rule, which let Athlin be the first king of England. 200 years later, that battleground would be set when English King Henry II wanted to expand his kingdom to Ireland. In the spring of 1171, King Henry II, accompanied by a retinue of knights and soldiers, sailed from England to Waterford, Ireland. Upon his arrival, he quickly set about asserting his authority, demanding the submission of various Irish kings and chieftains to his rule. Henry was determined to establish English control over Ireland and firmly believed that the Irish king should acknowledge his sovereignty. As news of King Henry's arrival spread across the island, reactions among the Irish leaders were mixed. However, when various Irish bishops and clergymen met at the Synod of Castile in 1171, these religious leaders recognized Henry II as the sovereign ruler of Ireland, acknowledging his authority to rule the island, making Ireland the first colony of England. Long before anyone knew they would be a global empire. Another H100 read years later, in 1277, King Edward I of England wanted to bring Wales under his control and incorporated into his kingdom. His desire to conquer Wales was driven by strategic, political, and territorial motivations. A journey towards the conquest of Wales began with the First Welsh War in 1277. Edward I launched a determined invasion into Gwynedd, in the heartland of Welsh resistance. In North Wales, his forces clashed with the Welsh defenders. Though fierce and relentless, the Welsh were eventually defeated, and their ruler, Prince Llewellyn, was compelled to submit to Edward's authority. Having established his dominance in Gwynedd, Edward I set out to solidify his control over Wales. He understood that military might alone not be enough to subdue the Welsh spirit of resistance, so he devised a multi-pronged strategy. One of the critical components of his plan was to construct a network of imposing fortresses across Wales to maintain English dominance and keep the Welsh in check. Despite the initial show of force, Welsh resistance persisted, and in 1282 a second conflict erupted, known as the Second Welsh War. The war was fierce and hard-fought, but fate was not on the side of the Welsh, with the Welsh resistance largely quelled. Edward I swiftly solidified his conquest, making Wales part of the English kingdom. England's war struggles aren't done yet. From 1337 to 1453, the 100 Red Year War began with England and France. The everlasting conflict weakened both empires and kept England tied to their tiny island. Right after the 100 Years' War, England was amid another war. This time, it was between the House of Lancaster and the House of York. In the infamous War of the Roses from 1455 to 1487, the Lancastrians won, and King Henry V was declared king. The rest of the world was starting to open up. Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean, blew in 1492, and landed in the Bahamas. After his initial landing, Columbus explored several other islands in the Caribbean, including Cuba and Hispaniola, now shared between the Dominican Republic and Haiti. He also explored the coast of present-day Central and South America, including Venezuela and Panama. This discovery of a massive landmass led the British government to desire land on this new continent when Italian Giovanni Caboto sought support from King Henry V to explore this new continent and find a direct route to Asia. King Henry was intrigued and granted Caboto a patent which authorized him to explore and claim any lands he might discover for the English crown. Giovanni changed his name to John Cat, and he was ready to go in May 1497. Cat set sail from Bristol, England, in hopes to find a passageway to Asia. He led a crew of about 18 men aboard a small ship called the Matthew. Their journey across the Atlantic was challenging as they faced treacherous weather conditions and unknown dangers. After several weeks at sea, on June 24th, 1497, Cabot and his crew finally spotted land. They had arrived somewhere along the eastern coast of North America in an area later named Newfoundland. As it was Newfoundland, Cabot and his crew were greeted by an unfamiliar landscape and encountered indigenous peoples, likely the Bothic or Mi'kmaq, who had lived in the region for thousands of years. Cat claimed the land for England, planting the English flag on the shore and taking possession of the newly discovered territory. The exact duration of Cat's stay in the New World is uncertain, but it is believed that he explored the coastline briefly before returning to England, arriving back in Bristol in August 1497, where he was celebrated as a hero for his achievements. Kit's discovery spread quickly throughout Europe, generating great excitement and interest. This successful voyage provided the English with hope of finding a western route to Asia and competing with other European powers in the lucrative trade markets of the East. Encouraged by his success, Cat made a second voyage in 1498, possibly intending to explore further and solidify England's claim to the newfound lands. However, the details of this expedition are lost to history. Some reports suggest that the voyage was successful, while others claim it ended in disaster, with Cat and his crew lost at sea. While back in England, King Henry VIII was married to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. During their beginning years of marriage, everything was going fine like any king at the time. He was forced to be loyal to the Catholic Church and yearned for a strong and legitimate heir to secure his dynasty. However, Henry's heart grew heavy with a troubling dilemma as the years passed. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon had only yielded a single surviving child, Princess Mary. The king's desperate desire for a male heir began to consume him, and he became increasingly convinced that his marriage was invalid in the eyes of God. Turning to the Pope for a solution, Henry beseeched the Holy See to grant him an annulment of his marriage to Catherine. He argued that the marriage was unlawful, for Karen had previously been married to his older brother Arthur, who had passed away. According to the Old Testament, marrying one's brother's widow was strictly forbidden, and Henry believed this was why he lacked a male heir. However, fate had other plans. The Pope, influenced by Catherine's powerful nephew, Emperor Charles V of Spain, refused to grant the annulment. Frustration and desperation gripped the king's heart, and he made a momentous decision. In a bold and unprecedented move, Henry VIII decided to break away from the Roman Catholic Church and establish his own church within England. So in 1530, the English Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, formally severing England's ties to the papacy and officially creating the Church of England, with King Henry VIII to be its spiritual leader, and Anglicanism was born. After King Henry divorced and beheaded his other wives, his daughter from Catherine, Mary I became queen and was nicknamed Bloody Mary through her killing spree to re-establish Catholicism. But her reign was short-lived, as her half-sister Elizabeth I would soon take over and redeclare England to be a Protestant state. Elizabeth passed the Act of Supremacy in 1559, which made Elizabeth supreme governor of the Church of England. She also passed the Act of Uniformity, establishing the Book of Common prayer as the official liturgy. However, outside of England, the race for colonization has already begun under King Philip the Spanish established colonies across the South American continent. The Spanish were expanding their wealth from the former capital of the Aztec to Neuland to Machu Picchu in Peru and the Andes Mountains in Chile along the Brazilian coast. The Portuguese had several settlements like São Vicente Pernambuco and Rio de Janeiro. The French established northern colonies in Quebec and some small territories in Florida called Fort Caroline. The race for overseas land was on, so Queen Elizabeth commissioned an army of seafarers to discover this planet. The group, colloquially known as the Sea Dogs, was given legal access to pillage and loot all Spanish ships they saw with the hopes of creating British dominance on the global stage. One of her first appointees was John Hawkins, a pardoned killer who saved his life by joining the Royal Navy in 1561. Hawkins made a voyage down to the Canary Islands, a Spanish island colony off the coast of Africa. Hawkins saw a process that would make him wealthy and hurt human beings. He learned about how to capture and sell people into slavery. With his new knowledge in 1562, Hawkins set sail traveling along the African coast of Sierra Leone, where he captured 300 Africans and trapped them in their ship. From there, he sailed to the Caribbean. He did not have permission from either Spain or Portugal to trade with their colonies, so he sold his enslaved people in Isabela, Porto, the Plata, and Monte Cristi, places where the local authorities did not enforce government trade embargoes. The enslaved people were traded for pearls, hides, and sugar. The trade was so prosperous that when he returned to England, he was knitted and to be called Sir. In October 1564, Hawkins went on another voyage back to Sierra Leone. He took over 400 enslaved people from Africa. Some he bought from the Portuguese, others he kidnapped directly by raiding the coast. He left Africa on January 29th, 1565. On April 3rd, 1565, Hawkins arrived at Borborada in Venezuela. As trade was prohibited, he carried out a fake threat of force with the local governor's collusion. He then traveled to Rio de Lasha, where he used power to ensure the deals he thought were fair. He sold 300 enslaved people. He was paid in gold, silver, and other precious items, and took further orders to trade enslaved people on a future voyage. His third slave voyage wasn't as easy as the first two. When he arrived on the African coast, he could not gather any enslaved people because of a Portuguese embargo. He attempted to capture and kidnap the inhabitants of a village near Cape Verde, but he was wounded and had to retreat. Hawkins recruited a local king in Sierra Leone to help him forcibly kidnap people, capturing over 500 people on February 7th. 1568, he set sail across the Atlantic Ocean to sell these people. He sold some of his captives in Margarita province and others in Barbarata at Rio de Lasha. The governor refused him permission to trade, so Hawkins and his assistant Francis Drake shot his house, and they took over the town before selling the enslaved people on his retreat, though the voyage ran into the Spanish port of San Juan Dua. Because of a storm, the Spanish cannons roared to life in the middle of peace talks, sending cannonballs hurtling through the air towards the English ships. Though outnumbered, Hawkins' fleet maneuvered skillfully, evading the deadly projectiles and returning fire with cannons. The battle raged on, and the English sailors fought with fierce determination. However, amid the chaos, Hawkins and his men had a choice: retreat or spend the rest of their lives in a Spanish galley. 114 men became prisoners, while Hawkins and 15 others returned to England and made a handsome profit. Regardless of the morals, slavery was a lucrative business, and the English would do anything to protect it. That's when in 1577 she sent Francis Drake to find a new trade passage to Asia. Unlike previous explorers, Drake knew of the existence of America and wanted to find a way around the massive landmass so they could reach the lands of Asia. Drake's first destination was around Cape Horn, the southern tip of South America. The fierce winds roared, and the waves towered like mountains, testing the crew's resolve and camaraderie. But Drake's steady leadership and unwavering determination carried them through, and they emerged from the Strait of Melon into the boundless Pacific Ocean. The world was their oyster as they sailed northward along the western coast of South America. The landscapes were a tapestry of untamed beauty, and the wildlife fascinated and intrigued them as they journeyed onward. They reached a land of one to the present-day coast of California. Here, they made a landfall in a place of beauty and bounty, naming it Nova Albion in honor of England, their beloved homeland. Their voyage then stretched through the Pacific and took them to Indonesia, which was aptly called the Spice Islands, at the time a treasure trove of fragrant delights. Here they traded with the welcoming locals, exchanging goods and stories from distant lands. The journey homeward was challenging. The vastness of the Indian Ocean and the unpredictable seas tested them, but Drake's ingenuity and determination guided them safely around the Cape of Good Hope, the southern tip of Africa. Finally, after nearly 3 years of adventure and discovery, the Golden Hind returned to England in September 1580 and was united as Sir Francis Drake. Looking upon this new world, the English realized that if they wanted to grow as an empire, they would need to establish a colony in the New World. In 1584, Queen Elizabeth I granted Sir Walter Raleigh a charter to explore and colonize the land of the New World. Raleigh dispatched an expedition led by Sir Richard Grenville to Roanoke Island off the coast of present-day North Carolina. The group consisted of about 100 men, including soldiers, scientists, and artisans. They arrived in 1585 and began building a fort and interacting with the local Native American tribes. A relationship between the English colonists and the Native Americans was initially positive as they traded goods and exchanged knowledge. However, tensions rose over time, and the region's harsh conditions, including disease and food shortages, strained the colonists' morale. Amid the challenges, Sir Francis Drake, on his way back to England after another successful privateering expedition, offered to take the colonists back with him. Disheartened by the hardships, many of the settlers accepted the offer and returned to England in 1586, leaving the Roanoke colony to fail. Raleigh tried again a year later in 1587 with 118 settlers, but yet it was found abandoned just 3 years. Later in 1588, Spanish King Philip II felt he had a moral duty to take over England in the name of Catholicism, so he sent the Spanish Armada, which wasn't just an ordinary naval force. It was arguably one of the scariest ones in history. The Armada consisted of around 130 ships. Among these ships were galleons, which were the principal warships of the Armada. Galleons were large, heavily armed vessels that were the backbone of the Spanish fleet during that period. Accompanying the fleet were more than 30,000 soldiers, sailors, and marines who were part of the expedition. The soldiers were seasoned veterans, while the sailors were experienced navigators and crew members, many of whom had participated in previous naval campaigns. The Spanish Armada was intended to be a formidable force capable of overpowering any opposition and making England a colony of the Spanish Empire. On the other side of the English Channel, Queen Elizabeth and her advisors were well aware of the impending threat. She called upon her naval commander, Sir Francis Drake, and her Vice Admiral Charles Howard to prepare the English fleet for the upcoming battle. Despite being outnumbered and having fewer and smaller ships, the English Navy had a significant advantage in maneuverability and firepower. In the late spring of 1588, the Spanish Armada sailed towards England confident of its superiority. However, the English had a cunning plan. Using smaller, more agile ships, they sacked the Armada. As it made its way along the coast of England, the English ships would attack from the rear, firing salvos at the larger, slower Spanish vessels, and then quickly retreat, making it difficult for the Armada to respond effectively. As the Spanish fleet approached the English Channel, the English sent 8 ships' vessels loaded with flammable materials and set ablaze towards the Armada, the site of the fiery infernos. Heading their way unnerved the Spanish sailors, who broke formation to avoid the risk of being consumed by the flames. This disruption further weakened the Spanish fleet and allowed the English to gain a tactical advantage. The decisive Battle of Gravens came on July 29th, 1588, off the coast of Gravens, France. The English fleet engaged the Spanish Armada in a fierce and prolonged battle. The English employed innovative naval tactics, including shipboarding techniques involving grappling hooks and small arms fire, to engage the enemy at close quarters. After a full day of intense fighting, the Spanish Armada, battered and disoriented, attempted to regroup. However, the English were relentless in their pursuit with dwindling supplies and earned the name of the 9 Years' War. The Irish people and the English suffered for the conflict brought untold hardships to both sides as the Irish were near defeat in 6,000, and one a glimmer of hope appeared on the horizon when a small Spanish expeditionary force arrived to aid the Irish rebels. It was a welcome respite, and the tide seemed to turn in their favor for a moment, but fate had other plans. The turning point came at the Battle of Kinsale, where the Irish and Spanish forces suffered a crushing defeat. The dream of independence disappeared, and the rebellion's fate hung in the balance in 6,000, and the rebellion came to an end. The Irish forces, tired and depleted, surrendered to the English, crowned the terms of the Treaty of Ment granted pardons to the rebels, allowing them to retain some of their lands and religious freedoms. However, the treaty also led for the language of Gaelic to be systematically destroyed. Catholicism was to be strongly discouraged. Only Anglicanism. Ireland was to be transformed into England, to no longer be a Gaelic country, but one of the Anglo-Saxons. However, England didn't just want to be the master of its neighbors, it wanted control over the New World. So in 6006, the Virginia Company of London was founded to find wealth and a passage to the Pacific with the blessing of King James. On December 20th, 6006, 104 settlers left the River Thames in London, and throughout the cold, blustery winter went off to the New World after a grueling winter on sea. On the fateful day of May 13th, 607, the settlers arrived on a marshy peninsula in a town they've named Jamestown after their king. Upon reaching the shores of the New World, the colonists marveled at the breathtaking beauty of the untamed land. The lush green forests, crystal clear waters, and abundant wildlife promise a paradise. But paradise quickly turned into a harsh reality. The unfamiliar environment presented numerous challenges. With its relentless heat and humidity, the Virginia climate proved unbearable for many. Disease spread among the settlers, taking its toll on their health and strength. Malaria and dysentery ran rampant, claiming many lives and making each day a struggle for survival. The colonists faced another formidable adversary: hunger. They had arrived when crops were not yet ready for harvest. With dwindling supplies and no fertile soil to plant, the settlers found themselves on the brink of starvation. Their situation was dire, but the settlers' spirits were not quickly broken. They toiled day and night, determined to find a way to survive and thrive in this new land. They explored the surroundings, hoping to find sustenance and establish relations with the native inhabitants, the Powhatan Confederacy. However, the initial interactions with the Powhatans were fraught with misunderstandings and mistrust. The settlers struggled to communicate and negotiate, leading to clashes and heightened tensions. The Powhatans, understandably cautious of these strangers, did not readily embrace the newcomers' leadership within the colony. Also faced challenges with shifting power dynamics and a lack of solid direction. The settlers grappled with maintaining unity and ordered the departure of their bold leader. John Smith further exacerbated the situation, leaving them adrift in the harsh winter of 609, known as the starving time. The colonists faced their darkest hour. Food supplies ran out, and desperation set in. They ate whatever they could find, even horses, pets, and leather, but it was never enough. The colony's population dwindled as hunger, disease, and conflicts with the Powhatans took their toll. Despite all odds, a glimmer of hope emerged. A young and innovative settler, John Ralph, introduced tobacco cultivation to Jamestown. The crop thrived in the Virginia soil and climate, bringing financial prosperity to the struggling colony. Tobacco quickly became a valuable commodity, attracting more settlers and rejuvenating Jamestown's fortunes. With their determination renewed, the settlers worked tirelessly to build a better future. They established better relations with some of the Powhatans, learning from each other's ways and building bridges of understanding in English. Colony was finally able to be established on American soil while Jamestown was burgeoning. As a colony, merchant William Hawkins was sent to establish trade in India in 6007. He sailed from the port of Plymouth, England, aboard the Hector, accompanied by a fleet of 3 ships. The crew was a mix of experienced sailors, traders, and diplomats carrying various goods to trade with distant lands. After a perilous voyage fraught with storms and rough seas, the fleet arrived at the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, marking a significant milestone in their journey. They entered the vast Indian Ocean and made their way towards the western coast of India. Hawkins arrived in the Port of Sur in 6008 one of the most important. Trading centers on the Indian west coast, the Mughal Emperor Jahangir, who ruled over a vast empire, showed a keen interest in foreign trade and welcomed the English visitors Hawkins first. Meeting with Emperor Jahangir occurred in Agra near the famous Taj Mahal. Through skilled interpreters, they engaged in discussions about trade politics and culture. The emperor was intrigued by the English goods and desired further interaction and trade with England. The negotiations between Hawkins and the Mughal emperor resulted in a favorable agreement granting the English East India Company the privilege to establish a trading post in Surat. This marked the official beginning of England's trade relations with India by 1612. The Surat trading post was an entire operation where the English would begin trading for various Indian goods, such as textile, spices, and indigo in exchange for English weapons and metal, where in 1615 an English diplomat of the name Sir Thomas Roe arrived at the grand court of Emperor Jahangir, the Mughal emperor. As Sir Thomas Roe stepped into the opulent halls of the Mughal court, he was greeted with a display of cultural grandeur unmatched in the West. The colorful fabrics, the exquisite jewelry, and the sweet aroma of incense filled the air. The English envoy was mesmerized by the splendor of the Mughal Empire. Amidst the regal surroundings, Sir Thomas Roe presented King James I letter to Emperor Jahangir, a token of goodwill and friendship. In return, he gave a collection of rare English goods, marveling at the Mughal appreciation for luxurious commodities. Over the 3 years Roe spent in Jahangir's court, England increased trade and influence in the lands of India. While back in England, King James made his religious expectations very clear. Everyone must be Anglican. If you do not comply, leave. That's when the idea of America came to spark in their minds a place where they can openly practice whatever they choose without any say by